the royal family locked away their disabled relatives to protect the purity of the bloodline. But here's what they didn't want you to think about too carefully. That bloodline they were so desperate to preserve looks less like a family tree and more like a Christmas wreath. The branches don't spread outward. They loop back on themselves, generation after generation. Cousin marrying cousin. The same genetic material recycling through centuries until the very disabilities they hid may have been written into their DNA by the ancestors they celebrated. And no one was supposed to notice. Their names were Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon, first cousins to Queen Elizabeth II, first cousins to Princess Margaret. They shared blood with the woman who would rule the British Empire for 70 years. And for most of those 70 years, the royal family pretended they didn't exist. Not neglected, not forgotten. Erased. Nerissa Jane Irene Bowes-Lyon was born on the 18th of February, 1919. Her younger sister, Catherine Juliette Bowes-Lyon, arrived 7 years later on the 4th of July, 1926. Their father was John Herbert Bowes-Lyon, brother to the woman the world would come to know as the Queen Mother. Their mother was Fenella Hepburn Stewart Forbes Trefusis, a name that matters more than it might seem. Remember that maternal line. It becomes important. Both sisters developed severe intellectual disabilities. They never learned to speak. Historical accounts describe them as having the cognitive capacity of young children throughout their entire lives, unable to care for themselves, unable to communicate through language, unable to participate in the garden parties and curtsies and social performances that defined aristocratic existence. In 1941, when Nerissa was 22 and Catherine was 15, their mother made a decision. She signed the papers. She sent them away. Royal Earlswood Hospital in Redhill, Surrey, a psychiatric facility. But here's where it gets strange. On that same day in 1941, 3 of their cousins from the Fane family were also admitted to Royal Earlswood. Idonia, Etheldreda, Rosemary. All first cousins, all from the same maternal bloodline, the Trefusis family, connecting to Lord Clinton's line. All with severe developmental disabilities. 5 first cousins, same family branch, same condition, same day. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. And patterns have causes. The Fane sisters shared the same maternal great-grandparents as Nerissa and Catherine, Charles Hepburn Stewart Forbes Trefusis and his wife. That bloodline produced all 5 affected cousins. Idonia, Etheldreda, and Rosemary Fane would spend their entire lives in institutional care, just like their Bowes-Lyon cousins. They were hidden with the same efficiency, their existences equally inconvenient to the families that had produced them. The Fane sisters died in obscurity. Their deaths weren't covered by the press the way Nerissa's would eventually be. No reporters tracked down their graves. No headlines announced their passing. They simply ceased to exist, as they had been made to cease existing decades earlier, when the family decided that 5 disabled first cousins were 5 too many to acknowledge publicly. When Lord Clinton, the head of the family line that connected all 5 women, was later asked about the cover-up, he denied any deliberate concealment. But the facts remained. 5 women, same bloodline, same rare condition, same institutional fate, same silence. The clustering wasn't random. When geneticists see this pattern, multiple individuals within a single family line all manifesting the same rare condition, they recognize the signature of recessive genetic inheritance, the kind that emerges when family trees become wreaths, when the same ancestors appear on both sides of a pedigree, when genetic material recycles rather than diversifies. The Bowes-Lyon family wasn't dealing with two unfortunate daughters. They were dealing with something embedded in the bloodline itself, something that 5 children from closely related parents all inherited. And their solution wasn't medicine or acknowledgement or even quiet family care. Their solution was to make these women disappear. Royal Earlswood Hospital in 1941 was not what modern audiences might imagine when they hear the word hospital. It was a psychiatric institution of the old style, built in the Victorian era, designed for long-term containment rather than treatment, structured around managing patients rather than rehabilitating them. The facility had been established in 1855 as the Royal Earlswood Asylum for Idiots. That name tells you everything about the era's approach to developmental disabilities. These weren't people to be supported. They were conditions to be managed, embarrassments to be housed, problems to be stored somewhere out of sight. By the time Nerissa and Catherine arrived, the facility held hundreds of patients in ward-style accommodations. Privacy was minimal. Personal possessions were limited. Patients wore institutional clothing. Reports from former staff and investigators would later describe conditions where residents had to share undergarments, where personal dignity was a luxury the system didn't provide. The daily routine was institutional monotony. Meals at set times, limited activities, minimal stimulation for people whose conditions meant they couldn't advocate for themselves, couldn't complain about their treatment, couldn't contact family members who might intervene. The women who couldn't speak had no voice in any sense. Staff turnover was constant. The people caring for Nerissa and Catherine changed year after year, decade after decade. No consistent relationship, no individual attention, just the grinding routine of institutional care. Feeding, cleaning, managing, containing. Nerissa would spend 45 years in these conditions. Catherine would spend 73. 45 years of institutional breakfast, institutional lunch, institutional dinner. 45 years of shared clothing and ward living, and staff who came and went while the patients remained. For Catherine, nearly 3/4 of a century. From age 15 to age 87. The facility itself eventually closed. The building that housed the Bowes-Lyon sisters for decades was converted to private residences after the institution shut down. People live in apartments there now. They probably don't think about the women who once occupied those spaces, the first cousins of the Queen, who spent their lives within those walls while the official record said they were dead. Let's talk about what that erasure looked like in practice. Starting in 1963, every edition of Burke's Peerage, the authoritative reference guide that documented British aristocracy with obsessive precision, listed both Nerissa and Catherine as dead. False death dates, fabricated endings. Someone had contacted the publishers and informed them that these women had died when they were, in fact, still alive and living at Royal Earlswood Hospital. Burke's Peerage doesn't investigate independently. They rely on families to report their own deaths and births and marriages. Harold Brooks Baker, the publishing director, said it plainly when the truth emerged. It is not normal to doubt the word of members of the royal family. The family told them these women were dead, so the record showed them dead. This wasn't passive neglect. This was active construction of a lie. Someone sat down and created fictitious death dates for living human beings so that genealogical researchers and historians and anyone curious about the Bowes-Lyon line would find a tidy entry showing these women had passed away decades before they actually did. Nerissa died in 1986. Catherine lived until 2014. For over 2 decades after 1963, the official record said they were dead, while both sisters were still breathing, still living in an institution, still first cousins to the Queen of England. For over 50 years, Catherine existed as a living ghost, officially dead, actually alive, completely erased from the story her family told about itself. And where was Queen Elizabeth II during all of this? In 1941, when Nerissa and Catherine were sent to Royal Earlswood, Elizabeth was 15 years old, a princess, third in line to the throne behind her uncle Edward, who would abdicate, and her father, who would become King George VI. She was old enough to know her cousins existed, old enough to notice when they vanished. By 1953, when Elizabeth was crowned queen in one of the most watched events in television history, her cousins had already been institutionalized for 12 years. The coronation was broadcast to 20 million viewers. Elizabeth swore an oath to serve her people, to uphold duty and tradition and the responsibilities of the crown. Her cousins watched nothing. They couldn't speak. They couldn't understand the oath their cousin was taking. They sat in Royal Earlswood, unmentioned, unacknowledged, while Elizabeth wore the crown. In 1963, when someone reported Nerissa and Catherine as dead to Burke's peerage, Elizabeth had been queen for 11 years. She was 37 years old. Her cousins were 44 and 37. Still alive. Still institutionalized. Now officially deceased. Buckingham Palace would later acknowledge that the Queen had been aware of the Bowes-Lyon sisters. This wasn't hidden from her. She knew, and the falsification happened anyway. The Queen who spoke constantly about duty, about family, about the weight of heritage and the importance of service. That Queen knew her first cousins had been declared dead while they remained alive in a psychiatric hospital. And she said nothing. For 23 more years. But here's where the story reaches its most grotesque irony. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon herself, the aunt of Nerissa and Catherine, the woman whose own brother had fathered these hidden women, served for decades as the patron of MenCap, the Royal Society for Mentally Handicapped Children and Adults, Britain's leading charity for people with learning disabilities. Read that again. The Queen Mother was the public face of Britain's most prominent charity supporting people with developmental disabilities. She attended their galas. She lent her name to their fundraising campaigns. She posed for photographs at MenCap events, smiling warmly, the very picture of royal compassion for society's most vulnerable. While her own nieces rotted in an institution, while their names appeared in official records as deceased, while no one from the family apparently visited them for decades. The Queen Mother accepted accolades for her charitable work supporting disabled individuals. She received praise for her compassion. She was celebrated as a patron who genuinely cared about the welfare of people with intellectual disabilities. People exactly like Nerissa and Catherine. And she never said a word about her own family's treatment of their own disabled members. This wasn't ignorance. The Queen Mother knew her nieces existed. She knew where they were. She knew what the family had done. The institutionalization, the erasure, the false death dates in Burke's peerage. She knew all of it, and she stood at MenCap events anyway, accepting the charity's gratitude for her patronage, embodying the monarchy's supposed commitment to helping disabled Britons. The hypocrisy is almost too precise to be real. A woman hiding her disabled relatives while serving as the symbolic champion of disabled rights. A patron of mental health charity whose own family had created false death certificates for mentally disabled nieces. A public figure celebrated for compassion she apparently never extended to her own blood. After the 1987 exposure, questions were raised about the Queen Mother's role in all of this. She never answered them. Not publicly. Not privately, as far as the record shows. She died in 2002 at the age of 101, having never publicly acknowledged or apologized for the treatment of Nerissa and Catherine. MenCap itself was placed in an impossible position when the scandal broke. Their patron, Their symbolic leader, their connection to royal prestige, had been complicit in exactly the kind of treatment their organization existed to combat. The charity that fought for the dignity and inclusion of people with learning disabilities had been led by a woman who approved of hiding them. The Queen Mother kept the patronage. MenCap kept quiet. The institution protected itself, as institutions do. Now, let's talk about the wreath. The defenders of monarchy love to speak about bloodlines, heritage, the genetic continuity that supposedly justifies hereditary rule. The royal family has spent centuries cultivating an image of superiority rooted in breeding. The careful selection of marriage partners to maintain the purity of the line, the exclusion of commoner blood as contamination. But that line isn't pure. It never was. And the proof is written in medical history across every royal house in Europe. Queen Victoria married Prince Albert in 1840. He was her first cousin. Their mothers were sisters. This wasn't scandal. This was standard practice. Royals married royals. The pool of acceptable partners was small by design. Victoria and Albert had 9 children. Those 9 children married into royal houses across Europe, carrying their mother's genetics with them, including one particular gene that Victoria carried without knowing it, a recessive mutation for hemophilia, a blood clotting disorder that causes uncontrolled bleeding from even minor injuries. Victoria's son Leopold inherited the condition and died at 30 from a brain hemorrhage after a fall. Her daughters Alice and Beatrice were carriers. They married into the German and Spanish royal families, spreading the mutation across the continent. Alice's daughter Alexandra married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Their son, Tsarevich Alexei, inherited hemophilia. The boy's constant medical crises drove his mother to desperation. She turned to Grigory Rasputin, a mystic who seemed able to calm the child's bleeding episodes. Rasputin's influence over the royal family contributed to the political instability that led to the Russian Revolution in 1917. The Romanovs were executed. All of them. A recessive gene carried by Queen Victoria helped bring down an empire. But hemophilia was almost benign compared to what centuries of inbreeding produced in the Spanish Habsburgs. The family that ruled Spain for nearly 200 years was so obsessed with keeping power within the bloodline that they married uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, generation after generation. They didn't branch outward, they looped back. A wreath. Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the product of generations of this genetic recycling. His father and mother were uncle and niece. His grandparents included 2 uncle-niece marriages and 1 first-cousin marriage. Geneticists have calculated his inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how much of his DNA came from identical ancestors, and found it exceeded what would be expected from a child whose parents were brother and sister. The physical consequences were documented by his contemporaries. Charles couldn't chew food properly due to his severely deformed jaw, a condition called mandibular prognathism that appeared repeatedly in Habsburg portraits, each generation's jaw more pronounced than the last. He couldn't walk until age 8. He suffered seizures. He was described as mentally disabled, barely able to conduct state business, manipulated by advisors who managed the empire in his name. Charles II was the last Spanish Habsburg. He died at 38. Leaving no heirs. His body had been so damaged by inbreeding that he couldn't produce children. The genetic wreath had strangled itself. This is documented history, medical fact. The royal families of Europe bred themselves into hemophilia, deformity, infertility, and cognitive disability. The bloodline purity they celebrated was producing exactly what they feared. The Bowes-Lyon family wasn't continental royalty. They were Scottish aristocrats. But they moved in the same circles, followed the same rules, married within the same narrow pool of acceptable bloodlines that defined European aristocracy. And when 5 first cousins from the same maternal line all develop the same rare condition, geneticists recognize what they're looking at. Recessive genes work through a specific mechanism. Every person carries genes for various conditions that remain dormant because they possess only one copy, inherited from one parent. You have the gene, but you don't have the condition. You're a carrier. The gene sits silent, expressed in neither your body nor your life. Here's where inbreeding changes the equation. When both parents share recent common ancestors, when the family tree loops back on itself, the probability that both will carry the same recessive mutation increases dramatically. If your great-great-grandmother carried a recessive gene for a developmental disability, and you marry someone who is also descended from that same great-great-grandmother, you've both potentially inherited the same silent gene. The odds of your children receiving 2 copies, one from each of you, and thus developing the condition, rise substantially. This is called homozygosity. 2 identical copies of a gene, one from each parent, both trace back to a common ancestor. The more intermarried a family becomes, the more their genetic diversity decreases, the more likely homozygosity becomes for any recessive trait in the bloodline. The 5 Bowes-Lyon and Fane cousins shared common ancestry through their mother's line: Nerissa, Catherine, Idonia, Etheldreda, and Rosemary. 5 children from the Trefusis bloodline, all manifesting severe intellectual disability. Modern genetic research has extensively documented the relationship between consanguineous marriages and elevated rates of recessive genetic disorders. Studies published in peer-reviewed scientific journals have found significantly higher rates of intellectual disability among children of related parents compared to children of unrelated parents. No official medical diagnosis for the sisters has ever been made public. Their specific conditions remain undisclosed, their medical records private. What can be established is statistical probability and documented pattern. 5 first cousins, same maternal bloodline, same rare condition, same institutional fate. The family wasn't hiding an embarrassing anomaly in an otherwise pristine bloodline. They were hiding what the bloodline itself had produced. This is the irony at the center of everything. The Bowes-Lyon sisters were concealed because they didn't fit the image of royal genetic superiority. Their disabilities were treated as shameful, as threats to the family's carefully cultivated mystique of heritage and breeding. The decision to institutionalize them and then falsify their deaths was about protecting that image. But the image was a lie. That bloodline they were so desperate to protect was already compromised by exactly the practices they celebrated. The generations of cousin marriages, the narrow pool of acceptable partners, the genetic recycling that aristocrats treated as purity, those practices were producing the outcomes they feared. They weren't protecting an untainted bloodline from the emergence of disability. They were hiding evidence that the bloodline had never been what they claimed. Now, the defenders of this system will tell you something at this point. They'll say it was standard practice. Families in the 1940s institutionalized disabled relatives. That's just what people did. You can't judge historical actions by modern standards. The sisters probably received adequate care at Royal Earlswood. Let's examine that argument with the respect it deserves, which is none. The Bowes-Lyon family maintained Glamis Castle, a Scottish estate that had been in the family for centuries. They employed dozens of household staff. They possessed wealth accumulated over generations of aristocracy. They had access to private physicians, private nurses, governesses, and every resource that money could purchase in early 20th century Britain. Wealthy British families in the 1940s routinely employed full-time nursing staff to care for disabled relatives at home. Private nursing care was an established option for those who could afford it. The costs, while substantial for ordinary families, would have represented a modest expense for a family connected by blood to the crown itself. The Bowes-Lyon family had resources exceeding those of virtually any ordinary British family. They had staff. They had properties. They had options that working-class families couldn't dream of. When a factory worker's child was disabled, institutionalization might genuinely have been the only available option. When the Queen's cousins were disabled, the family could have hired 10 private nurses and never noticed the expense. But let's say, for argument's sake, that institutional care was the best medical option available. Let's accept that premise temporarily. The standard practice defense still doesn't explain the falsified records. Sending disabled relatives to hospitals was one thing. Reporting them as dead in official publications while they remained alive was something else entirely. Even families who chose institutional care didn't, as standard practice, create fictional death dates for living people. That choice was separate. That choice was deliberate. That choice was about reputation, not medical necessity. No one was forcing the Bowes-Lyon family to tell Burke's peerage that Nerissa and Catherine had died. No social convention required that lie. They chose to construct it. They chose to maintain it for decades. They chose to let the record stand even after both women were elderly, even after most of the people who might have judged them in 1941 were dead. And the standard practice defense definitely doesn't explain the documented absence of family contact over 45 years. If the family had maintained relationships, visiting regularly, sending correspondence, checking on welfare, the situation would look different. Institutional care combined with continued family involvement would be one thing, but the evidence suggests something darker. There is no documented record of visits from any member of the Bowes-Lyon family or the royal family during the sisters' decades of institutionalization. No birthday acknowledgments, no Christmas packages, no letters. Catherine spent 73 years in care facilities. The record suggests those years passed without family contact. They didn't just send them away, they severed the connection entirely. The truth emerged in April 1987, not through royal acknowledgement, not through any ethical reckoning within the family. Through investigative journalism, reporters discovered that Nerissa Bowes-Lyon had died the previous year, on the 22nd of January 1986, at the age of 67. They found where she'd been buried, Redstone Cemetery. Her grave was marked only with a plastic tag bearing a number and her name. No headstone, no monument. Nothing befitting a first cousin of the Queen of England. The woman who shared blood with the monarch, buried with minimal ceremony, her resting place nearly anonymous, indistinguishable from someone with no family at all, someone who had been truly alone in the world. But Nerissa hadn't been alone. She had family. She had wealthy, powerful family. She had a first cousin wearing a crown. They just didn't show up. The investigation revealed that Catherine was still alive, 60 years old, still living at Royal Earlswood. She'd spent 46 years in the institution by that point, longer than most people spend in any single place in their entire lives. Apparently no visits from her royal relatives during all those decades. The tabloid Sun ran banner headlines. The British press turned sharply critical. Here was documentation of deliberate concealment, falsification of official records, apparent abandonment of family members who'd been declared dead on paper while they continued to breathe, to exist, to live out year after year in institutional care. The public was outraged when they learned the details. Nerissa's unmarked grave, Catherine's decades of apparent isolation, the false death dates maintained for 24 years, the complete absence of family contact that anyone could document. Buckingham Palace issued a carefully worded statement. They acknowledged that the Queen had been aware of the Bowes-Lyon sisters, contradicting any suggestion that the concealment happened without royal knowledge, but characterized it as a private family matter. The Queen had known, and she had done nothing. The Queen Mother, whose own brother had fathered these women, made no public statement, not one word of explanation, not one expression of regret. Her nieces had been erased from existence, and she offered nothing to the public that had just learned about it. She remained, of course, the patron of MenCap. Princess Margaret was reportedly disturbed by the revelation. Some accounts suggest she'd been genuinely unaware of her hidden cousins, that the concealment had been so complete that even Elizabeth's own sister didn't know. If true, this makes the cover-up even more remarkable. The family had hidden Nerissa and Catherine not just from the public, but from members of their own household. But no member of the royal family stepped forward to apologize. No one explained the decision to falsify records. No one took responsibility for decades of deception. The palace wall of silence held. Catherine's situation changed somewhat after the exposure. Following the public attention, financial provision for her care reportedly increased. A headstone was eventually provided for Nerissa's grave. Better late than never. Though Nerissa had been dead for over a year before anyone thought she deserved more than a plastic tag. But documented evidence of royal visits, of family reconnection, of any sustained attempt to restore what had been denied for so many decades, that doesn't appear in the public record. Catherine remained institutionalized. When Royal Earlswood Hospital eventually closed, she transferred to other care facilities. She spent the rest of her life in institutional settings. She died on the 23rd of February, 2014, at the age of 87. 73 years in care facilities. From age 15 to age 87. The woman who was listed as dead for over 50 years finally died for real. A private family funeral was held. Whether any members of the royal family attended that funeral is not publicly documented. She spent more time institutionalized than most people spend alive. More than 7 decades. Her entire adult life. Every birthday, every Christmas, every ordinary day spent in facilities, separated from the family that shared her blood by more than just geography. And the family that erased her from official records, that created fictional death dates for her, that apparently never visited during decades of institutionalization, they were the same family that talked constantly about duty, about tradition, about the importance of bloodline and heritage and continuity, about family. There's a question that keeps surfacing in conversations about the British monarchy. Not about Nerissa and Catherine specifically, but about the institution itself, about what else might be hidden, about patterns that might extend beyond 2 forgotten women in a psychiatric hospital. Diana Spencer entered that family young and glamorous and full of life. She left it shattered. The details of how the institution treated her, the isolation, the control, the ways her struggles were managed rather than supported, have been discussed extensively elsewhere. But certain questions remain open. How does an institution that could erase living relatives from official records treat a woman who threatens their carefully managed image? What patterns of silence and control existed before Diana arrived? Harry Windsor grew up inside that institution. He left it publicly, permanently, and with specific accusations about being silenced and controlled. His stated reasons for leaving center on the institutional culture, the expectation of silence, the management of image above all else, the family dynamics that prioritized reputation over welfare. 2 people from different generations, both describing the same patterns. What else is hidden in that wreath? The question isn't rhetorical. It's the logical extension of documented evidence. If the family could falsify official records for over 4 decades, if they could erase living people from genealogical publications, if they could maintain that deception through multiple reigns and generations without any internal whistleblower, without any family member breaking ranks. What else have they successfully concealed? The Bowes-Lyon sisters only came to light through investigative journalism, not through any royal transparency. Without those reporters in 1987, Catherine would have died in complete obscurity, her existence unknown to the public, her connection to the crown permanently buried in false records. She would have passed away as a documented dead person, dying again. How many Nerissas and Catherines didn't get discovered? The monarchy presents itself as an institution of tradition, stability, and heritage. The bloodline is the product they're selling. The genetic continuity is the brand. They've spent centuries cultivating an image of superiority rooted in breeding, in the careful selection of marriage partners, in the exclusion of common blood. But the line isn't pure. It never was. It's a wreath. And the wreath produced Nerissa and Catherine, women whose existence had to be erased because they revealed what generations of cousin marriages actually create. The family didn't hide them, despite their reverence for bloodline. They hid them because of it. The sisters were evidence. Inconvenient, living, breathing evidence that the genetic superiority the monarchy claimed didn't exist. That the careful breeding they celebrated might be producing exactly what they feared. That the wreath was tangling into itself. So they reported them dead. They stopped visiting. They buried Nerissa with a plastic tag. They left Catherine in an institution for 73 years. And the Queen Mother kept attending men-cap galas, smiling for cameras, accepting praise for her compassion toward disabled people. Nerissa Bowes-Lyon, born 18th of February, 1919, institutionalized 1941, listed as dead from 1963. Actually died 22nd of January, 1986. Buried without a headstone until journalists noticed. Catherine Bowes-Lyon, born 4th of July, 1926, institutionalized 1941. Listed as dead from 1963. Actually died 23rd of February, 2014. Spent 73 years in care facilities. First cousins to Queen Elizabeth II. First cousins to Princess Margaret. Nieces to the Queen Mother. Erased from official records by the family that shared their blood. There's something else that needs to be said before this ends. The comments on stories like this often come from people who've cared for family members with developmental disabilities. People who've sat with someone day after day, year after year, providing the kind of attention and presence that Nerissa and Catherine apparently never received from their famous relatives. People who know what it costs, emotionally, financially, physically, to actually show up for someone who can't speak, who can't care for themselves, who will never attend garden parties or curtsy to dignitaries. Those caregivers chose differently than the Bowes-Lyon family chose. They didn't have castles, they didn't have dozens of staff, they didn't have connections to the crown or inherited wealth or aristocratic resources accumulated over centuries. They had far less, and they gave far more. If you've cared for someone with developmental disabilities, if you've been the person who didn't walk away, who didn't falsify records, who didn't pretend they were dead, I want to hear your story. The comments section exists for exactly this conversation. The people who actually lived this experience, who made different choices than the family with infinite resources, deserve to have their stories told too. The Bowes-Lyon sisters were hidden because they didn't fit an image. They were declared dead because their existence embarrassed a family that prized bloodline above all else. They were abandoned by the very relatives who could have most easily provided for them. And the bloodline they threatened? The heritage they embarrassed? It was a wreath all along, branches looping back on themselves, the same genetics recycling through generations, the very conditions they feared potentially produced by the very practices they celebrated. That's not tragedy. That's absurdist irony, and it happened within living memory. Catherine died in 2014. Queen Elizabeth II, who knew about her hidden cousins for decades, ruled until 2022. This isn't ancient history. This is documented, verified, relatively recent institutional behavior from a family that still asks for public reverence, public funding, and public trust. The wreath is still there. The patterns are still documented. The questions remain unanswered. Subscribe for more stories like this.